Not much is known about dwarf women or children. Whenever we encounter Durin's folk in the books of Tolkien or in the private letters he wrote, he usually only discusses the great deeds performed by men, which has led to quite a few questions about not just the society of the dwarves, but what did their children and women look like? After thinking about this issue for a while, I ended up on a particular question, one that you might think is a bit weird, but I wondered whether or not dwarf babies had beards. Again, this might be a weird question, but I think it's totally fair to ask. Today, we're going to answer that. So first things first, when you think of dwarves, what do you imagine? You probably conjure an image of a short, stocky warrior fitted into thick leather pads or chainmail. Like Gimli in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, you likely envision a long curly beard tucked into a belt buckle around their waist or, dangling around. And in either arm, they'd either carry a double-bladed axe or a hammer for forging. Now, have you ever wondered why they look like this and not something more similar to men or elves? After all, the elves and the men, while they have some physical differences, actually pretty much look the same. The elves, as a rule, are more resilient to physical harm and illness, and they typically have fairer skin or straighter hair and, usually leaner figures. But they basically just look like a peak human being. Meaning, that Middle-earth's most beautiful men and most beautiful women probably would be indistinguishable from normal elves. But we really couldn't say the same thing about dwarves. Even the most beautiful dwarf of Middle-earth would stand in stark contrast to the elves. And this is because they weren't created by the same person. Men and elves are known as the children of Iluvatar, and Iluvatar himself is the creator of all of existence. He is the main creator deity of Tolkien's universe, and it was his own vision that brought about both elves and humans. But the dwarves had a different origin. Iluvatar's first creation, even before the birthing of the universe, was a group of godlike beings known as the Ainur. You can just imagine these guys as Judeo-Christian angels. Now, when these angelic beings eventually made their way to Arda, which was Tolkien's name for the planet the continent of Middle-earth laid on, these angels began to cultivate and form the earth. And at that time, it wasn't much more than a ball of steaming water and craggy rocks. It was a really, really rough draft version of Earth. Now, the angelic Ainur took the task of making the world habitable, and from that time became more similar in form to our own Norse or Greek gods. Among these gods, one named Aule, the Valar god of smithing and crafts, decided that he couldn't wait for the birth of Iluvatar's children. And as I've often discussed on this channel, Aule became impatient and decided to create his own children, the dwarves. Now, since Aule didn't really understand Iluvatar's grand vision for the universe, that meant that the bodies and the temperament of the dwarves would probably be a bit different than Arda's intended inhabitants. Again, everything in the world was made with the idea that eventually only two species, men and elves, would come into being and would inhabit Earth. So things were made for just those two types of races. For the sake of some really simple analogies, just imagine giraffes. They've evolved on our own world to be able to eat leaves on the tips of branches of acacia trees. But what would happen if a similar herbivore was thrown into the same environment, but with a few crucial changes, a bit shorter, a bit stockier, and a bit slower? How would a bison or a moose, for example, handle the terrain of the African savanna? Now, I know that's not the greatest parallel, but it's the best one I can think of. The dwarves were designed disproportionately because their creator, the god of smithing and crafts known as Aule, only kinda sorta knew the forms the elves and men would take on when they arrived on Arda. So you could kind of say he was working with only half the information at the time that he was making the dwarves. Alright, so that explains why dwarves look so different from the other sentient races on Arda. So due to Aule's design choices, is it possible that besides the men, babies also had beards at birth among the dwarf race? Now, when we look beyond the men of dwarf society and ask whether or not women too had beards, it seems like the likely answer is yes. Now, it's easy to conflate the scenes from the movies with the actual text from Tolkien's books, even for the most diehard fans like me. In the Hobbit trilogy, there were a few scenes of Lake Town that featured dwarf vendors, and among them were women with facial hair. And you'll also remember that in the Lord of the Rings films, Gimli jokes about the fact that dwarf women are so similar in appearance to dwarf men that had given rise to the fact that there are no dwarf women at all, and that dwarves just sprung out of the ground. So in the film universe, we know that the dwarf women had beards, but if we take a look at Tolkien's text, we find several passages that not only seem to corroborate that, but also indicate that even dwarf infants were born with beards. One passage in particular from the appendix says, quote, "They are in voice and appearance, and in garb, if they must go on a journey, so like the dwarf men, that the eyes and ears of other people cannot tell them apart." This was said in reference to dwarf women, and we've heard variations of this claim before. It's not quite definitive though, as it doesn't flat out tell us that the dwarves were born with beards. It simply says that the bias of men and elves made them unable to tell the difference between dwarf males and females. But when we dig further, there was more. In a completely different section a bit farther back, Tolkien wrote regarding the early dwarves that, quote, "No man nor elf has ever seen a beardless dwarf, unless he were shaven in mockery, and would then be more like to die of shame. For the Nalgrim have beards from the beginning of their lives, male and female alike." Now, that's the type of definitive answer we've been looking for. So according to this quote, yes, the dwarves were born with beards, which means that even dwarf babies had facial hair. But I think it's pretty safe to say that they weren't born with the waist-long whiskers that we'd later see Gimli sport in the movies. I'd imagine dwarf babies, like human babies, were born with just a bit of hair on their heads, so perhaps their beards matched that. Maybe dwarf babies' beards were more like extra thick peach fuzz than the steel wool of Thorin's company. In any case, I'm glad that we asked this question because it's always interesting to see how detailed Tolkien was when he created the different worlds and races in his world.